July 18th, 1815. Waterloo, Belgium. Napoleon's army lies defeated. Wellington has won. The future of Europe is decided. 200 miles away in London, nobody knows yet. Official news will take 3 days to arrive by government courier. But Nathan Mayer Rothschild, sitting in his usual position at the London Stock Exchange, already has the information. His private courier network, the fastest in Europe, has delivered news from the battlefield in just 24 hours using carrier pigeons and relay riders. Then, on the afternoon of July 19th, Rothschild does something unexpected. He doesn't announce the victory. Instead, he starts selling British government bonds aggressively. Other traders see Rothschild selling and panic. They know about his courier network. They know he always has information first. Therefore, Wellington must have lost. Napoleon is coming. Britain is finished. They start dumping their bonds. The price collapses. Then, Rothschild's agents, positioned throughout the exchange, start quietly buying everything at rock-bottom prices. The next day, official news arrives. Britain has won. British bonds skyrocket in value. Nathan Rothschild has just executed the most profitable trade in financial history. The collective assets of the 5 Rothschild brothers in spring 1815 came to £500,000. In July 1816, it was £1 million, doubling the family fortune in 1 year. But here's what makes this story important. This wasn't just insider trading before laws existed. This was a demonstration of something that would define the next 200 years. Whoever controls information and capital controls nations, not through armies, but through debt.
During the Napoleonic Wars, battlefield intelligence traveled slowly, often hours or days.
Over the next 210 years, 5 banking dynasties would build the modern financial system. They would finance both sides of wars. They would create central banks on 3 continents. They would establish institutions that govern global finance today. And they would accumulate wealth and power beyond anything achieved by kings or emperors. The power wasn't hidden. It was legitimized through law, through government partnerships, through systems so complex that nobody questioned who designed them. But it all started with one family and one simple business model.
Their model was simple. Know first, act first, profit first.
In the age of wires and whispers,
let's understand the formula before we see how it conquered the world. In the 18th century, European monarchs needed money constantly. Wars, palaces, infrastructure, all required capital. Traditional banking was constrained by geography. A bank in London could only lend to the British government. A bank in Paris could only lend to the French government. But one family figured out how to break that limitation. Mayer Amschel Rothschild started as a coin dealer in Frankfurt in the 1760s. He had 5 sons. In the early 1800s, he made a decision that would change financial history. He sent each son to a different financial capital. Nathan to London, James to Paris, Salomon to Vienna, Karl to Naples. Amschel stayed in Frankfurt. Then something revolutionary happened. This created the first truly international banking network. The 5 brothers could move money across borders through internal family transfers, avoiding normal restrictions on international finance. And then they perfected the business model. Finance both sides of every conflict. Take no political position. Ensure that whoever wins owes you money. When Britain went to war with France, the Rothschilds lent to the British government in London and the French government in Paris. Whoever won would repay the debt. The Rothschilds couldn't lose. From 1813 to 1815, Nathan Mayer Rothschild was instrumental in almost single-handedly financing the British war effort, organizing shipment of bullion to Wellington's armies across Europe. In 1815 alone, the Rothschilds provided £9.8 million in subsidy loans to Britain's continental allies, equivalent to about $850 million trillion today. This business model, financing all sides of every conflict, taught governments a lesson they would never forget. Wars are won not by the biggest army, but by whoever can borrow the most money. By 1815, after Waterloo, the Rothschild family was the most powerful financial institution in Europe. Therefore, the question becomes, how did they turn financial power into control over governments? After Waterloo, European governments are drowning in debt. Decades of wars have bankrupted France, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia. They all owe massive amounts to the Rothschilds and other banking houses. Nathan Rothschild in London becomes the dominant financier of the British government. When Britain needs to borrow money, they come to Rothschild. He underwrites the bonds. He sells them to investors. He collects fees on every transaction. And then, something remarkable happens. By the 1820s, Rothschild controls the issuance of British government debt. He decides the interest rates. He decides which investors get access to the bonds. Therefore, if the British government wants to pursue a policy Rothschild opposes, he can refuse to finance it. This gives Rothschild effective veto power over British fiscal policy without holding any official government position. The pattern repeats across Europe. James de Rothschild in Paris finances the restored French monarchy. Salomon von Rothschild in Vienna finances the Austrian Empire. Karl von Rothschild in Naples finances the Kingdom of Naples. By 1830, the Rothschild family held an estimated 50% of all government bonds in Europe. Think about that. Half of all government debt on the continent is owed to one family. But government debt is just the beginning. The real power comes from controlling the monetary system itself. Then comes the critical move. In the 1820s and 1830s, European governments operate on a gold standard. Currency is backed by gold. The amount of gold in circulation is limited. Governments can't print money freely unless they have a central bank. A central bank can issue currency, set interest rates, and lend to the government without the constraints of gold backing. Britain already has the Bank of England, created 1694, but it's a private institution owned by shareholders. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds are major shareholders. Other European countries don't have central banks yet, and then the Rothschilds start pushing for their creation. Why? Because central banks can create money to pay government debts, and the Rothschilds hold most of that debt. In Austria, Salomon von Rothschild helps establish the Austrian National Bank. In France, James de Rothschild influences the Bank of France. In Italy, Karl von Rothschild works with the Bank of Naples. These aren't government institutions. They're private banks granted monopoly power to issue currency, and the Rothschilds are either major shareholders or primary creditors. Therefore, by 1850, the Rothschild family has influence over monetary policy in Britain, France, Austria, Naples, and Prussia. They don't need to hold government office. They control the institutions that control the money. But Europe is old, established. The real opportunity lies across the Atlantic, in a new country with unlimited potential and no entrenched financial system. America. In the early 1800s, America has no central bank. The first bank of the United States, 1791 to 1811, was allowed to expire. The second bank of the United States, 1816 to 1836, was killed by Andrew Jackson, who famously declared, "Ye be a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout ye out, and by the eternal God, I will rout ye out." He succeeded. The charter expired in 1836. America operates without a central bank for the next 77 years. But America still needs capital. Railroads, factories, infrastructure, all require massive investment. American banks don't have enough, so they turn to Europe. Then, in 1837, August Belmont arrives in New York as the Rothschild family's agent in America. He establishes August Belmont and Company, which becomes one of the most powerful banking houses in New York. Belmont isn't building an American bank. He's integrating American capital into the European system, controlled by the Rothschilds. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederacy need money. European banks, including Rothschild-affiliated institutions, finance both sides. And then, after the Civil War, American industry explodes. Steel, railroads, oil, manufacturing, requiring enormous capital. European banks provide it. But by the 1880s to 1890s, a new power emerges in American finance. Not European, not Rothschild-affiliated, purely American. J.P. Morgan. John Pierpont Morgan is born in 1837 to a wealthy banking family. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, runs a merchant bank in London. J.P. Morgan starts his career in his father's bank, learning European finance. In 1871, he partners with the Drexel family to form Drexel Morgan & Co. in New York, later renamed J.P. Morgan & Co. Morgan builds his power through industrial consolidation. He merges competing companies into monopolies. He creates U.S. Steel by merging Carnegie Steel and other companies into a $1.4 billion corporation, the first billion-dollar company in history. He consolidates railroads. He restructures failed companies. By 1900, J.P. Morgan controls more capital than any American bank. But he's not independent. He's still connected to European banking through his father's London bank and partnerships with Rothschild-affiliated institutions. Morgan is the bridge, bringing European capital to America, exporting American wealth to Europe. Then, in 1907, that bridge becomes critical. The Panic of 1907 starts when the Knickerbocker Trust Company fails. This triggers bank runs across New York. Depositors rush to withdraw money. Banks don't have enough cash reserves. The banking system is hours away from complete collapse. The U.S. government has no mechanism to stop it. No central bank, no lender of last resort. J.P. Morgan steps in. He locks New York's major bankers in his library and forces them to create a pool of money to bail out failing banks. Morgan personally decides which banks will be saved and which will fail. The crisis is contained. The system survives. But it teaches Wall Street a lesson they will never forget. America needs a central bank, and it needs to be controlled by bankers, not the government. The question is, how do you create a central bank in a country that's rejected them twice before? November 22nd, 1910. A private train car departs from a New Jersey railway station. 7 men are aboard, traveling in complete secrecy to Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private resort owned by J.P. Morgan and other wealthy families. Munsey's magazine described the Jekyll Island Club in 1904 as the richest, the most exclusive, the most inaccessible club in the world. The 7 passengers: Nelson Aldrich, U.S. Senator, Chairman of the National Monetary Commission. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr. Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, later Citibank, representing William Rockefeller. Paul Warburg, partner at Kuhn, Loeb & Co., with close ties to the Rothschilds. His brother Max Warburg ran Warburg & Co. in Germany. Henry P. Davison, senior partner at J.P. Morgan & Co. Charles D. Norton, president of First National Bank of New York, a Morgan Bank. Benjamin Strong, vice president of Bankers Trust, who would become the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. A. Piatt Andrew, assistant secretary of the Treasury. These 7 men represented an estimated 1/4 of the total wealth of the entire world. Then comes the elaborate secrecy. Aldrich knew their ties to Wall Street would arouse suspicion. To prevent the staff from learning their identities, the men used only first names during the train journey. Nelson, Harry, Frank, Paul, Hyatt, and Arthur. They later referred to themselves as the First Name Club. The group adopted the cover of a gentleman's duck hunt. One attendee even carried a borrowed shotgun to maintain the ruse. Why the secrecy? Knowledge of who wrote the plan could have influenced people's perception of the value of the ideas and the likelihood of its political passage. Translation: if the American public knew that Wall Street bankers were designing a central bank, it would never pass Congress. And then they spend 9 days at the Jekyll Island Club drafting legislation. The conferees forged the Aldrich Bill, which, with only minor variations, would become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The only substantial disagreement at Jekyll Island was tactical. Aldrich wanted a straightforward central bank on the European model, while Warburg insisted that political realities required the reality of central control to be cloaked in the palatable camouflage of decentralization. Warburg's duplicitous strategy won. Therefore, they designed a system that looked decentralized but was actually controlled by Wall Street. They disguised it in 3 ways. First, called it the Federal Reserve System, not the Central Bank of the United States. The word federal made it sound like a government institution. Second, created regional Federal Reserve banks to make it look decentralized. But the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, controlled by Wall Street, would hold most of the power. Third, structured it as a private corporation owned by member banks, not the government. The government would appoint the board of governors, but the shareholders would be private banks. The meeting remained a closely guarded secret and would not become widely known until the 1930s. But the plan still had to pass Congress, and Americans hated central banks. How did they pull it off? December 1913, the Christmas Eve coup. The Federal Reserve Act was introduced in Congress in 1913. Most congressmen didn't understand it. The bill was over 1,000 pages. Then comes the political maneuvering. The Democrats captured the House in 1910 and the White House in 1912. The bankers had to regroup and recast the legislation as a Democratic bill under Virginia Representative Carter Glass. Frank Vanderlip later wrote, although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that was finally adopted. They changed the name, kept the structure. To get the Federal Reserve Act passed, Wilson needed support from populist William Jennings Bryan. Wilson convinced him that because Federal Reserve notes were obligations of the government and because the president would appoint members of the Federal Reserve Board, the system would be under government control. It was a masterful deception. And then, on December 22nd and 23rd, 1913, just before Christmas recess, when most members had left Washington, the bill passed. The House voted on December 22nd. The Senate voted on December 23rd. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law on December 23rd, 1913. The Federal Reserve began operations in 1914. Benjamin Strong, one of the Jekyll Island attendees, became the first governor of the New York Fed. He would run U.S. monetary policy for the next 14 years. Paul Warburg, the Kuhn Loeb partner with ties to European banking, became a member of the Federal Reserve Board. Therefore, the structure of the Federal Reserve ensured that Wall Street banks controlled monetary policy. The New York Fed held the largest gold reserves. It conducted open market operations. It had direct relationships with European central banks. The shareholders of the Federal Reserve banks were private member banks: J.P. Morgan, National City Bank, First National Bank. This created a system where private banks own the institution that controls the U.S. money supply. The government appointed some officials, but operational control remained with Wall Street. And the connection connections to European banking dynasties remained intact. Paul Warburg maintained relationships with his brother in Germany and Rothschild-affiliated banks in Europe. The Federal Reserve wasn't created by the government to serve the public. It was created by bankers to serve banks. But surely this new power would be used responsibly, right? August 1914. World War I begins. The Federal Reserve has been operational for just a few months. Then it's immediately weaponized. Between 1914 and 1918, the Federal Reserve creates over $25 billion in new money to finance America's entry into World War I. That money is lent to the government at interest. The government borrows. The Fed creates money. The banks profit. But the real money is in financing the Allies. J.P. Morgan and Company becomes the primary underwriter for British and French war bonds. The company lends over $3 billion to the Allies during the war, equivalent to over $70 billion today. The Rothschilds finance various governments. The Warburgs split between Germany and America. Family members on both sides of the conflict, but maintain their banking relationships. Therefore, World War I becomes the most profitable event in banking history. Millions die, empires collapse, families are destroyed, and banking dynasties collect interest on every bullet, every bomb, every death. But the real consolidation of power comes after the war. After World War I, Europe is economically destroyed. Britain and France owe enormous debts to American banks. Germany is crushed by war reparations. The banking dynasties financed all of it. By the 1920s, J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and Rockefeller-controlled National City Bank dominate American finance. Then, in 1929, the stock market crashes. The banking system collapses. Thousands of banks fail, but the dynasties survive. J.P. Morgan and Company survives. National City survives. Kuhn Loeb survives. They have enough capital and government connections to weather the crisis. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forces J.P. Morgan and Company to split into a commercial bank, J.P. Morgan and Company, and an investment bank, Morgan Stanley, but the same families control both. Then, World War II erupts. J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, and other American banking interests finance the Allied war effort. The U.S. government borrows over $260 billion to fight the war. The Federal Reserve creates the money. The banks underwrite the bonds. By 1945, the United States holds 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. American banks are the only major financial institutions still standing. European banks are destroyed. The British Empire is bankrupt. Therefore, global financial power shifts permanently from Europe to America. And the banking dynasties that control American finance are about to design the post-war system. July 1944. Representatives from 44 nations meet in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to create the post-war financial system. The official attendees are John Maynard Keynes for Britain and Harry Dexter White for the United States. But behind them are the banking interests that will benefit from the new system. The Bretton Woods Agreement creates two institutions. The International Monetary Fund to manage international currency stability. The World Bank to finance reconstruction and development, both headquartered in Washington, D.C., both funded by member nations, but controlled by the largest shareholders, primarily the United States. And critically, the dollar becomes the global reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency will be pegged to the dollar. The dollar will be pegged to gold. Therefore, this gives the United States, and by extension the banks that control U.S. finance, power over the global monetary system. But there's a third institution most people don't know exists: the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The BIS was founded in 1930 in Basel, Switzerland. The official purpose was to handle German war reparations. The real purpose was to coordinate central bank policy across borders. The BIS is owned by central banks. Only central banks can be members. The Federal Reserve, Bank of England, Bundesbank, Bank of Japan, all are members and shareholders. The BIS operates beyond the reach of any single government. It has immunity from Swiss law. It can't be prosecuted. Its meetings are secret. It coordinates monetary policy among the world's central banks. During World War II, the BIS continued operating, even though board members included central bankers from both Allied and Axis nations. After the war, the BIS remained operational and became the coordinating body for the post-war financial system. Therefore, by 1945, the banking dynasties have created three global institutions. The Federal Reserve, 1913, controls U.S. monetary policy. The BIS, 1930, coordinates global central banks. The IMF and World Bank, 1944, leverage over developing nations. The families behind these institutions, the Morgans, Rockefellers, Warburgs, maintain control through board positions, ownership stakes, and revolving door relationships between government and finance. But the system still depends on the dollar being backed by gold. That constraint limits how much money can be created. In 1971, that constraint is removed. By the late 1960s, the Bretton Woods system is breaking down. The United States has been printing dollars to finance the Vietnam War and Great Society programs. The number of dollars in circulation far exceeds the gold reserves backing them. Foreign governments, especially France under Charles de Gaulle, start demanding to exchange their dollars for gold at the official rate of $35 per ounce. The U.S. gold supply is hemorrhaging. Then, on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon closes the gold window. No more gold redemptions. The dollar, and by extension, every currency on earth, becomes pure fiat currency, backed by nothing but government promises. This is the most significant monetary change in history. Therefore, central banks now have unlimited power to create money. Without gold backing, the Federal Reserve can create as much money as needed. The only constraint be inflation. But inflation can be managed through interest rates and by convincing the public to trust the system. From 1971 to 2024, the Federal Reserve creates over $20 trillion as the money supply expands exponentially. Asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate explode. Who benefits? The people who own assets. And who owns most assets? The wealthiest families and the institutions they control. The modern system works like this. The Federal Reserve creates money by buying government bonds, open market operations. The Fed buys bonds from banks. Banks get cash, which they lend out, creating more money through fractional reserve banking. When there's a crisis, the Fed creates even more money. 2008, $4.5 trillion in quantitative easing. 2020, $5 trillion in COVID response. This money flows to banks first. Banks buy assets. Asset prices rise. The wealthy get richer. Everyone else sees inflation. The banking dynasties evolved but didn't disappear. Rockefellers moved into philanthropy and investment management. Morgans merged with Chase Manhattan, then Chemical Bank, forming J.P. Morgan Chase, now the largest bank in America with $3.9 trillion in assets. Rothschilds remain active through Rothschild & Co., a global advisory and wealth management firm with $100 billion in assets under management. Warburgs merged with other banks, remaining influential through various investment vehicles and foundations. But the real power isn't in the families anymore. It's in the institutions they created. The Federal Reserve controls U.S. monetary policy, $7.7 trillion balance sheet, created $20 trillion since 1971. The Bank for International Settlements, coordinates global central bank policy, 63 member central banks, secret meetings, immune from prosecution. The IMF controls $1 trillion in resources, holds debt over 190 countries, imposes austerity as conditions for loans. The World Bank lends $100 billion annually. Projects often benefit Western corporations. The big banks, JP Morgan Chase, $3.9 trillion. Bank of America, $3.1 trillion. Citigroup, $2.4 trillion. These are descendants of the Morgan and Rockefeller banks. Goldman Sachs maintains the revolving door between Wall Street and Washington. Robert Rubin, Treasury Secretary under Clinton, former Goldman co-chairman. Hank Paulson, Treasury Secretary under Bush, former Goldman CEO. Steve Mnuchin, Treasury Secretary under Trump, former Goldman partner. The system now operates at a scale the original dynasties couldn't have imagined. Federal Reserve balance sheet, $7.7 trillion. Global central bank assets, 30+ trillion. Total global debt, $307 trillion. Global derivatives market, $600+ trillion. Notional value. Therefore, the system built by 5 banking dynasties over 200 years now controls more wealth than the GDP of every nation combined, and it operates beyond democratic control. You don't vote for the Federal Reserve chairman. You don't vote on BIS policies. You don't approve IMF loan conditions. The system be designed to be insulated from public pressure while extracting wealth through debt, interest, and money creation. What happens when the system reaches its limits? The U.S. national debt is $36 trillion. Who owns that debt? Bondholders. Who benefits from the interest payments? The same banks that created the Federal Reserve. When the government borrows money, it issues bonds. The Federal Reserve buys those bonds by creating money from nothing. The government gets cash. The Fed gets interest-paying bonds. The banks get fees for facilitating transactions. It's a system where debt creates money. Money creates inflation. Inflation transfers wealth from savers to asset owners. The dynasties understood this 200 years ago. Whoever controls the creation of money controls the wealth of nations, not through violence, but through compound interest and monetary policy. Mayor Amschel Rothschild supposedly said, "Permit me to control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." Whether he actually said it doesn't matter. The principle is demonstrated by 200 years of history. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to discuss. The system is approaching its mathematical limits. Global debt is $307 trillion. It can't be repaid. Central banks can't stop printing money without crashing the system. When interest rates rise, governments can't afford debt payments. When interest rates fall, savers are destroyed and asset bubbles inflate. The families and institutions that control finance know this, and they're preparing, buying hard assets, gold, real estate, commodities, shifting from paper wealth to tangible wealth, positioning for the next crisis. While the public holds paper currencies and financial instruments, the dynasties are converting to things that can't be printed. Therefore, the next crisis won't be like 2008. It won't be a liquidity crisis solved by printing money. It will be a crisis of confidence in money itself. And when that happens, the families who designed the system will already be positioned for what comes next. Dash 1. Understanding this history isn't conspiracy theory. It's documented financial history. The Jekyll Island meeting happened. The Federal Reserve is privately owned. The BIS coordinates central banks in secret. The IMF imposes conditions on indebted nations. These are facts. What makes people uncomfortable isn't that it's false, it's that it's true. 5 banking dynasties built a system that controls the creation of money, operates beyond democratic oversight, extracts wealth through debt and inflation, survives every crisis while smaller institutions fail. The power isn't hidden anymore. It's institutionalized. The Federal Reserve, the BIS, the IMF, the World Bank, JP Morgan Chase, all operating, all powerful, all beyond your vote. The question isn't, did this really happen? The evidence is overwhelming. The question is, what happens when the system they built reaches its mathematical breaking point? Because $307 trillion in global debt can't be repaid. The central banks can't stop printing without collapse. And the dynasties that design this system are buying gold while you're told to trust paper. Understanding the history is the first step. Understanding what comes next is survival.